Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, this is the place where history comes to help you sleep. Not because history is dull, it genuinely isn't, but because we tell it here at the pace of someone who has nowhere particular to be and no particular urgency about getting there. So go ahead and get comfortable. Adjust whatever needs adjusting. Pull the blanket up. Turn the brightness down. And if you drift off somewhere in the middle of this, that is completely fine. That is, in fact, the entire point of being here. Tonight we are going to America. Not the America of the Revolution or the Civil War or the Founding Fathers making speeches in candlelit rooms. We are going to a different America. The America of the second half of the 19th century, when the United States government was engaged in a systematic, methodical, and frequently dishonest process of acquiring land from the people who had been living on it for thousands of years. We are going to talk about the men who sat across tables from U.S. government representatives and signed their names to documents that promised them things. And then we are going to talk about what actually happened afterward. This is not a story with clean heroes and clean villains, though it has moments that come close. It is a story about power and the limits of negotiation when one party to the negotiation has an army and the other party has a signature on a piece of paper. It is a story about men who were, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary, skilled leaders, careful thinkers, people who understood their situations with considerable clarity, and who nevertheless found themselves trapped in circumstances that no amount of skill or clarity could entirely resolve. We will move slowly. There are several men to meet, and their stories deserve the time. Let's begin with some context, because context matters here and the popular version of this history tends to skip it in favor of a simpler narrative. The treaty system between the United States government and Native American nations was not, in its origins, entirely cynical. Treaties were a legal mechanism. They implied recognition that the nations signing them were sovereign entities with rights that the United States was obligated to respect. The U.S. Constitution explicitly gave Congress the power to make treaties with foreign nations, and Native American nations were, for treaty purposes, treated as foreign nations. This was a legal acknowledgement that these were independent peoples with independent political authority. The problem was that the treaty system was applied inconsistently, interpreted selectively, renegotiated under duress, violated routinely, and eventually replaced altogether by a policy that simply stopped pretending the fiction of sovereign negotiation was operative. In 1871, Congress passed a law ending the practice of making new treaties with native nations, which was at least honest about what had been happening for the previous 50 years, even if honesty was not exactly the motivation. Between the 1780s and 1871, the United States made approximately 370 treaties with native nations. Of these, the United States violated every single one to some degree. Some were violated immediately. Some lasted a few years before being renegotiated under circumstances that made the original terms inoperative. Some were violated so gradually and so incrementally that the violation was essentially continuous. Not one was fully honored in perpetuity. This is not a contested historical claim. It is documented. It is the finding of the U.S. government's own historical commissions. It is, in the language of treaty law, a record of breach so consistent that it constitutes a pattern rather than an exception. Into this system walked a series of men who were trying, in good faith or in strategic calculation or in desperate necessity or in some combination of all three, to protect their people. They negotiated. They signed. They returned home to their nations and explained what they had agreed to. And then they waited to see what the United States would do next. What the United States did next was, almost without exception, less than what it had promised and more than what had been agreed upon. Less land protection, more encroachment, less autonomy, more supervision, less time. Let's meet the first of our men. His name was Sitting Bull. And before we get to the treaty part of his story, we need to spend a few minutes with who he actually was, because the popular version of Sitting Bull tends to reduce him to a symbol, the defiant warrior, the last holdout, the face on the poster, and the actual person was considerably more interesting than the symbol. Thatharenka Iotake, Sitting Bull, was born around 1831 in the Grand River region of present-day South Dakota. He was Hunkpapa Lakota, one of the 7 subnations of the Lakota Sioux Confederacy, and from an early age he demonstrated the combination of spiritual authority and practical leadership that would eventually make him the most prominent figure in the Lakota resistance to American expansion. He was a holy man. This is important and tends to get underemphasized in popular accounts that focus on his military reputation. Sitting Bull's authority among the Lakota was not primarily the authority of a war chief, though he was an experienced and respected warrior. It was the authority of a Wachasa Wakheng, a holy man, someone whose connection to the spiritual world was recognized by his community as genuine and significant. He had visions. He interpreted those visions. He performed the sun dance, the central religious ceremony of the Lakota, with a seriousness and commitment that commanded respect. When he spoke about what the spirits had told him, people listened because his track record of spiritual accuracy was considered to be very good. He was also, by multiple accounts, a man of considerable personal warmth. He was known for his generosity, a virtue of enormous importance in Lakota culture, where a leader's standing was partly measured by how much he gave away rather than how much he accumulated. He composed songs. He was fond of children. He had a dry sense of humor that people who knew him mentioned in their accounts of him, which is the kind of detail that tends to get lost in the monument-building version of historical figures. He was also, and this is the part that made him permanently inconvenient for the United States government, absolutely unwilling to sign away Lakota land. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 is the document at the center of Sitting Bull's story. It was signed between the United States and various Lakota leaders and established the Great Sioux Reservation, a large territory in present-day South Dakota that was guaranteed to the Lakota for as long as the grass shall grow and the water flow, which was the kind of language treaty negotiators used when they wanted to sound permanent without necessarily committing to permanence. The treaty also designated the Black Hills, Paha Sapa, as part of the unceded territory, meaning that even non-reservation Lakota had rights there and that American citizens were explicitly prohibited from entering without Lakota permission. Sitting Bull did not sign the Fort Laramie Treaty. He was not at the negotiations. He was one of the leaders who refused to engage with the treaty process at all because he did not recognize the authority of the United States to define Lakota territory in the first place. His position was consistent and clearly stated. The land was Lakota land. It had always been Lakota land. No piece of paper changed that. What changed things in the end was gold. In 1874, General George Armstrong Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills, in direct violation of the Fort Laramie Treaty. His expedition confirmed the presence of gold. News reached the east. Miners began flooding into the Black Hills. The United States government, faced with the choice of enforcing the treaty it had signed or allowing the gold rush to proceed, chose the gold rush. Enforcement was quietly abandoned. The miners kept coming. The Lakota watched the treaty they had been promised was permanent become, in practice, optional. The government then attempted to buy the Black Hills from the Lakota. A commission came to negotiate. Sitting Bull's response was to pour a handful of dirt onto the ground and say, in effect, that he would not sell even that much of Lakota land. The commission failed. The government decided that if the Lakota would not sell, they would need to be compelled by other means. What followed was the Great Sioux War of 1876 and 1877, which included the Battle of the Little Bighorn in June 1876, where Sitting Bull's vision, he had seen in his sun dance soldiers falling upside down into the Lakota camp like grasshoppers falling from the sky, was fulfilled when Custer's 7th Cavalry was destroyed by a combined Lakota and Cheyenne force. The Little Bighorn was a military victory. It was followed by what military victories against the United States Army tended to produce in this period, which was a larger and more determined military response. The Army came back. The Lakota dispersed. Sitting Bull led his people north into Canada, into the territory of the grandmother Queen Victoria, where the U.S. Army could not follow. He stayed in Canada for 4 years. The Canadian government was polite but not particularly generous with food or resources, and the buffalo, which had been the foundation of Lakota life and economy, were disappearing from the Canadian plains as thoroughly as they were disappearing from the American ones. His people were hungry. The situation was not sustainable. In July 1881, Sitting Bull returned to the United States and surrendered at Fort Buford, in present-day North Dakota. He was 50 years old, approximately. He handed his rifle to his young son Crowfoot and asked the boy to give it to the commanding officer, saying that he wished his son to understand that the only way to live as a Lakota man was in peace with the Americans. Whether this was a genuine sentiment or a performed one, Whether Sitting Bull believed what he was saying or was saying what the situation required is something we cannot know for certain. Probably both. He was held as a prisoner of war at Fort Randall for nearly 2 years. Not because he had done anything that violated American law. The war he had fought had been on Lakota territory, which was legally the Lakotas to defend, but because the Army considered him too influential to release immediately. He was, in their assessment, a symbol around which resistance could organize, and symbols needed to be managed. He was eventually released to the Standing Rock Agency on the Missouri River in 1883. Standing Rock was a reservation, not the vast territory guaranteed by the Fort Laramie Treaty. A reservation, a defined, bounded, administered space where the United States government provided theoretically food, clothing, and education in exchange for the land and autonomy that had been taken. The reality of reservation life in the 1880s was not what the theoretical exchange implied. The food was often inadequate, often late, and often of poor quality. The Indian agents, the government officials responsible for administering the reservations, ranged from competent and well-intentioned to corrupt and incompetent, with considerable representation at both ends of that range and most points in between. The educational program meant taking children away from their families and sending them to boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their languages or practice their religions, which was presented as a gift and experienced as something quite different. Sitting Bull navigated reservation life with the combination of dignity and strategic resistance that characterized everything he did. He refused to cooperate with policies he considered harmful. He maintained his religious practices. He spoke publicly, through interpreters, about what had been taken from his people and what had been promised and what had been delivered instead. He was, in the language of the Indian agents who reported on him to Washington, a troublemaker, a malign influence, a man whose continued prominence was an obstacle to the assimilation process. In 1885, he toured with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show for 4 months, which is one of those historical details that requires a moment to absorb. Sitting Bull, the man who had fought the United States Army for decades, riding into arena after arena to be introduced to audiences who had read about him in newspapers, receiving applause from the same population whose expansion had destroyed his world. He reportedly gave away most of the money he earned to street children. He found the poverty of American cities disturbing in a way he said he did not expect. He returned to Standing Rock after 4 months and did not tour again. The Ghost Dance movement began in 1889. It was a religious revitalization movement that originated with a Paiute holy man named Wovoka, who had a vision during a solar eclipse of a world restored. The buffalo returned, the dead ancestors returned, the land returned. The Ghost Dance spread rapidly across the Plains reservations, because the people on those reservations were hungry and grieving, and the vision of restoration was exactly what hunger and grief required. Sitting Bull was cautious about the Ghost Dance. He was not its leader at Standing Rock, though the agents reported him as such because they needed someone to blame for its spread, and he was the most convenient prominent figure available. The United States government became alarmed by the Ghost Dance movement, partly because alarm was their default response to any organized native religious or cultural activity, and partly because some of the Ghost Dance teachings included the belief that the special shirts worn by dancers would make them impervious to bullets, which the Army found threatening even though the shirts were, in fact, cloth. On December 15, 1890, Indian police, Lakota men employed by the agency to enforce reservation rules, came to Sitting Bull's cabin at dawn to arrest him. The order had come from Washington. The stated reason was to prevent him from leaving the reservation to join the Ghost Dance gatherings. The real reason was that he was Sitting Bull and the government had decided his continued existence at Standing Rock was incompatible with the management of the reservation. There was a confrontation outside the cabin. Sitting Bull's supporters gathered. One of them shot one of the police. In the struggle that followed, Sitting Bull was shot twice, once in the chest and once in the head, by members of the Indian police. He was 59 years old, approximately. He had spent the last decade of his life on a reservation, watched his people's autonomy systematically dismantled, seen the land promised by treaty reduced and then reduced again, and been arrested in the early morning by men of his own nation acting on orders from Washington. His horse, the performing horse he had ridden in the Wild West show, which Buffalo Bill had given him as a gift, heard the gunshots and began performing its show routine. It had been trained to dance and rear at the sound of firing. While Sitting Bull died in the mud outside his cabin, His horse danced. That detail is either unbearably poignant or deeply absurd or both. And like most things about Sitting Bull's life, it refuses to be reduced to a single clean interpretation. The man who said, "I will fight no more forever. Let's drift west now, out of the northern plains and into the Pacific Northwest, into the mountains and canyons of what is now Oregon and Idaho." We are going to meet a man whose story is, if anything, even more thoroughly documented than Sitting Bull's, and whose final surrender speech became one of the most quoted statements in American history, which is both an honor and a particular kind of irony given what happened after he said it. We are going to meet Hinmatu Yalatkekt. You know him as Chief Joseph. Joseph, the name was given to his father by a missionary and passed to the son, was born around 1840 in the Wallowa Valley of present-day Oregon. He was Nez Perce, a nation whose territory stretched across parts of what are now Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. The Nez Perce had a long history of peaceful relations with American settlers and explorers. They had helped the Lewis and Clark expedition, they had traded and interacted with fur traders and missionaries for decades, and the relationship had been, by the standards of the era, relatively calm. The Walla Walla Treaty of 1855 changed things. It reduced Nez Perce territory significantly but left the Wallowa Valley, Joseph's homeland, within the treaty boundaries. Joseph's father, Old Joseph, signed the treaty. He later said he regretted it, that he had not understood how much was being given up, and before he died in 1871, he made his son promise never to sell the Wallowa Valley. Young Joseph made the promise and kept it, which put him on a collision course with American expansion that was, given the circumstances, essentially unavoidable. A second treaty in 1863, negotiated under pressure and signed only by some Nez Perce leaders, not all, reduced the reservation further and removed the Wallowa Valley from the treaty lands entirely. Joseph and the bands who had not signed this treaty, who called themselves the non-treaty Nez Perce, refused to recognize it. Their position was straightforward. They had not signed it, therefore it did not apply to them, therefore they were still entitled to the Wallowa Valley. This was a legally coherent position. It was also a position that the United States government found extremely inconvenient as settlers moved into the valley and began demanding that the Nez Perce be removed. In 1877, the government gave the non-treaty Nez Perce an ultimatum: move to the reservation within 30 days or be forcibly removed. 30 days to abandon the homeland. 30 days to gather cattle and horses and belongings and cross rivers running high with spring snowmelt and arrive at a reservation that was not their land and had not been their choice. Joseph counseled compliance. He did not want war. He understood the mathematics of the situation. The Nez Perce were approximately 800 people, of whom perhaps 200 were fighting men. The United States Army was considerably larger. He counseled his people to accept the move, painful as it was, because the alternative was a war they could not win and the death of people he was responsible for protecting. They were in the process of complying, gathering their horses, preparing to move, when a small group of young warriors, enraged by the dispossession and by a specific personal grievance against a settler, attacked and killed several white settlers on the Salmon River. The attack made war inevitable. There was no going back to negotiation after settlers were dead and the army was mobilized. What followed was one of the most remarkable military retreats in American history. The Nez Perce, approximately 800 people, nearly half of them women, children, and elderly, traveled approximately 1,170 miles over 4 months through the mountains of Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana, fighting off the U.S. Army in a series of engagements in which they consistently outmaneuvered and occasionally defeated forces that were better equipped and, on paper, better positioned. Joseph was not the primary military commander during the retreat. That role was played primarily by two war chiefs, Looking Glass and Tuhul Hulzot. Joseph's role was to keep the non-combatants moving, to manage the logistics of moving hundreds of people through difficult terrain while being pursued by an army, and to maintain the cohesion and morale of a group of people who were watching their world end in real time. This is not a glamorous military role. It is arguably the harder one. They were aiming for Canada, for the same sanctuary that Sitting Bull had found north of the border. They were 40 miles from the border, in the Bear Paw Mountains of Montana, when General Nelson Miles caught them in a surprise attack in late September 1877. Looking Glass was killed by a sniper's bullet on the 4th day of the siege. The weather turned severe. The people were freezing and starving, and the border was 40 miles away and might as well have been 1,000. On October 5, 1877, Joseph rode out to surrender. The speech he made at the surrender has been translated and retranslated and quoted so many times that it has acquired a kind of iconic smoothness that probably does not entirely reflect the original. The most famous passage, in the translation that has been most widely reproduced, ends, "From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." What he actually said was interpreted by a Nez Perce man named Arthur Chapman and written down by an army officer named Charles Erskine Scott Wood, and the relationship between what Joseph said in Nez Perce and what Wood wrote in English was filtered through two layers of interpretation and translation and the literary sensibilities of a man who was, whatever else he was, a writer. The speech as we have it is probably more polished than the original. It is also, in its essential content, consistent with what Joseph said on other occasions and with his character as documented by everyone who knew him. He surrendered on the condition, or what he understood to be the condition, based on what Miles told him, that his people would be returned to the Northwest, to their homeland or near it. That was the promise. The promise was not kept. The Nez Perce prisoners were sent first to Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, where they arrived in the winter and were housed in a river bottom that was swampy and disease-ridden. They called it the Ikish Pa, the hot place. People died. 40 people died in the first winter, not in battle, of disease and exposure and the particular cruelty of placing people from the mountain Northwest in a Kansas river bottom in winter and calling it accommodation. They were then moved to the Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma, which was even further from home and even more climatically unsuitable for people whose bodies and lives had been shaped by the mountains and forests of the Pacific Northwest. More people died. Joseph called it the land of fever. He petitioned. He wrote letters. He requested meetings with government officials. He was, in the language of the administrators managing the situation, persistent. In the language of a man watching his people die in a landscape they were never meant to inhabit, persistent seems like an understatement. In 1879, Joseph traveled to Washington, D.C. and met with President Rutherford B. Hayes and various members of Congress. He gave interviews. He spoke clearly and without apparent bitterness about what had happened and what had been promised and what had been provided instead. His account of the situation was reported in newspapers and attracted considerable public sympathy, which was not entirely useless but was not entirely sufficient either. He made the argument that the Nez Perce had done nothing to deserve what was happening to them, that they had tried to comply with the government's demands, that they had been given a promise at the surrender that had not been honored, that they were dying in a place they had never chosen to be, that the basic terms of the agreement under which they had stopped fighting had been violated. These arguments were accurate. They were also, in the political climate of the 1870s and 1880s, insufficient to produce the outcome he was seeking. The machinery of Indian policy moved slowly and in directions determined by forces, land hunger, railroad interests, the politics of Western territories seeking statehood, that were considerably larger than the welfare of 800 Nez Perce in Oklahoma. In 1885, 8 years after the surrender, the surviving Nez Perce were finally allowed to return to the Northwest. Not to the Wallowa Valley. That was gone, settled by farmers and ranchers who had no intention of leaving. Some went to the Nez Perce Reservation in Idaho. Joseph and the people who had followed him most closely were sent to the Colville Reservation in Washington State, which was not their homeland and which they had no ancestral connection to, but which was at least in the Northwest, at least in a landscape that resembled what they had come from. Joseph lived at Colville for the rest of his life. He continued to petition for the return of the Wallowa Valley. He was allowed to visit in 1900 and walked through the valley he had been born in and had promised his father he would never sell, now entirely occupied by farms and towns and fences. He asked again to be allowed to return. The request was denied. The settlers who lived there objected to the idea of the Nez Perce returning, which is a position that contains a certain brazenness that the historical record simply has to acknowledge and move on from. He died in 1904 at the Colville Reservation. The agency doctor reported that he died of a broken heart, which is either a medical assessment or a metaphor, and possibly both. He was approximately 64 years old. He had spent 27 years after the surrender trying to return to a valley that the government had promised, in a treaty, was his. The Wallowa Valley is in Oregon. It is beautiful. People go there on vacation. There is a monument to Chief Joseph, the last one they caught. Let's move south now. into the desert southwest, into the mountains of Arizona and New Mexico and the Sierra Madre of northern Mexico. We are going to meet the last man, which is a title that sounds like an honor and was not entirely one. We are going to meet Goyle. You know him as Geronimo. Geronimo was born around 1829 in the mountains of what is now southwestern New Mexico, in the territory of the Badonko Apache. He was not originally a chief. He was a warrior and a medicine man, and his path to the leadership role he eventually occupied was not through inheritance or formal selection, but through a combination of extraordinary ability, personal loss, and the particular kind of authority that comes from surviving things that kill other people. In 1851, when Geronimo was in his early 20s, Mexican soldiers attacked his camp while the men were in town trading. They killed his mother. They killed his wife. They killed his 3 children. He came back from town to find them dead. He said, later in his life, that after this he no longer cared about death. This is the kind of statement that can be dismissed as dramatization until you look at his subsequent 40 years and observe that it is, in fact, supported by the evidence. He fought the Mexicans. He fought them for years with a persistence and a willingness to engage that went beyond military strategy into something more personal. The name Geronimo itself is of disputed origin. The most common account is that Mexican soldiers began calling him by the Spanish version of Jerome, San Geronimo, either as an appeal to the saint for protection or as a battle cry, and the name stuck. He also eventually fought the Americans. The Apache had been navigating a complicated relationship with the expanding United States, sometimes fighting, sometimes negotiating, sometimes doing both simultaneously. The Chiricahua Apache, the larger group of which Geronimo's band was a part, had a famous leader named Cochise who had negotiated a peace with the United States in 1872 and established a reservation in the Chiricahua homeland in southeastern Arizona. Cochise died in 1874. 2 years later, the Chiricahua Reservation was abolished and the Apache were ordered to move to the San Carlos Reservation further north, which was hot, flat, malaria-ridden, and entirely unsuited to people from the mountain country. Geronimo did not go quietly. He broke out. He went back to Mexico. He was brought back. He broke out again. He went back to Mexico. He was pursued by armies on both sides of the border, crossed the border repeatedly, was captured, escaped, was talked back to the reservation by Apache scouts, left again. This pattern repeated itself several times over the course of the 1870s and 1880s with a regularity that the United States Army found deeply exhausting. His final breakout was in 1885. He left the San Carlos Reservation with approximately 35 warriors, 8 boys, and 101 women and children, and spent the next year and a half evading approximately 5,000 U.S. soldiers, 500 Mexican soldiers, and an unknown number of Apache scouts in some of the most difficult terrain on the continent. 5,000 soldiers, against 35 warriors and a group of women and children in the mountains. The logistics of this pursuit were staggering, and the fact that it took a year and a half should tell you something about both the terrain and about Geronimo specifically. He surrendered, finally, in September 1886 to General Nelson Miles, the same Miles who had accepted Joseph's surrender 9 years earlier, which is a coincidence that suggests Miles had a particular assignment in the business of ending things. The surrender was negotiated on terms. The terms, as Geronimo understood them, were that he and his people would be held in Florida for 2 years and then returned to Arizona. The terms were not honored. The pattern was entirely consistent. Geronimo and the Chiricahua Apache were sent to Fort Marion in Florida, which was a coastal fort entirely unsuitable for desert mountain people. Then to Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama, which was humid and forested and so climatically different from the Arizona mountains that people got sick and stayed sick. Tuberculosis, respiratory illness. Children died. Adults died. They stayed in Alabama for years. Not 2 years. Years. While the 2-year promise of the surrender terms evaporated in the Alabama humidity. Meanwhile, Geronimo became famous. The newspapers had been covering his campaigns for years, and his surrender was one of the major news stories of 1886. He became a public figure in the way that the American press of the era created public figures, through a combination of genuine newsworthiness and mythologizing embellishment that made the real person increasingly difficult to locate inside the legend. In 1894, the Chiricahua were moved again, this time to Fort Sill in Oklahoma, which was at least drier than Alabama. Geronimo lived there for the rest of his life. He was considered a prisoner of war for the entire period, which is a designation that his lawyers, he had lawyers eventually, pointed out was legally questionable given that the war had ended with a negotiated surrender in 1886. The government maintained the designation anyway because releasing him without conditions seemed politically complicated. He farmed at Fort Sill. He sold signed photographs of himself at fairs and exhibitions, which he attended as a kind of living exhibit of frontier authenticity, charging for the privilege of shaking his hand. He was exhibited at the Trans-Mississippi Exposition in Omaha in 1898, at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo in 1901, at the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis in 1904. He rode in Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade in 1905, alongside other Native leaders, which Roosevelt arranged because he found authentic Western figures picturesque and historically significant, an attitude that contained a level of irony that Roosevelt did not appear to notice. He asked Roosevelt at a meeting in Washington to be allowed to return to Arizona. Roosevelt declined, explaining that the white settlers in Arizona still feared Geronimo and that his return would cause difficulties. Geronimo pointed out, with some precision, that he was an old man in his 70s who had been a prisoner for nearly 20 years and was not obviously a threat to anyone. Roosevelt was sympathetic and unmoved. Geronimo dictated his autobiography to a writer named S.M. Barrett in 1905 and 1906, with an Apache man named Asa Dakluji serving as interpreter. The autobiography, Geronimo, His Own Story, is one of the more remarkable documents of the period, a first-person account of Apache life and the Apache Wars told by the man who had been at the center of them. It is also, inevitably, a document shaped by translation and transcription and the particular conditions under which it was produced, which included Geronimo being a prisoner of war and Barrett needing permission from the U.S. Army to conduct the interviews. He died in February 1909. He had been thrown from his horse the previous night, had lain in the cold for hours before being found, and died of pneumonia at Fort Sill. He was approximately 80 years old. He had spent 23 years as a prisoner of war. He never returned to Arizona. There is a story, probably apocryphal but persistent, that his last words were addressed to his nephew Dakluji and expressed regret that he had ever surrendered, that he believed he should have continued fighting until he was killed rather than spending 23 years in captivity waiting for a return that never came. Whether he actually said this is impossible to verify. Whether he thought it is something only Geronimo could have known. His grave is at Fort Sill. There is a persistent and unconfirmed story that members of a Yale secret society dug up his skull in 1918, and that it has been in the society's possession since. His descendants have requested its return. The society has neither confirmed possession nor facilitated return. It is, in its way, a fitting coda, one last thing taken without consent, one last request unmet. The ones who tried the paperwork. There is a fourth kind of story in this history, and it is different from the stories of Sitting Bull and Joseph and Geronimo in one specific way. It is the story of the men who decided that the path forward was not resistance but legal and political engagement, who decided to learn the language of American law and use it, who sent their children to the schools, adopted the forms of American civic life, built institutions, wrote petitions, hired lawyers, argued cases. These men are less famous than the warriors. Their stories are less dramatic, but their experiences with the American treaty system were, in their own quiet way, equally instructive about the limits of good faith negotiation with a government that was not operating in good faith. Let's spend some time with a man named Stan Waddy. Stan Waddy was Cherokee, born in 1806 in Georgia, and his story begins not in the West but in the Southeast, where the 5 civilized tribes Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole had spent decades attempting to coexist with American expansion through assimilation and legal engagement. The Cherokee in particular had made extraordinary efforts in this direction. They had established a constitutional government modeled on the United States Constitution. They had a written language developed by a man named Sequoyah and a newspaper printed in that language. They had schools and churches and farms and legal institutions. They had, by the measures that American society claimed to value, become what American society said it wanted Native people to become. It did not help. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act authorized the forced relocation of the 5 civilized tribes from their southeastern homelands to Indian territory west of the Mississippi. The Cherokee took the United States government to court. Their case, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, went to the Supreme Court in 1831. Chief Justice John Marshall wrote that the Cherokee were a domestic-dependent nation with rights that the United States was bound to respect. A subsequent case, Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, found explicitly that Georgia had no authority over Cherokee territory and that the removal being demanded was unconstitutional. President Andrew Jackson's reported response to the Worcester decision was something to the effect that John Marshall had made his decision, and now Marshall could enforce it, which is not a legally sophisticated response but is, as a description of the practical situation, entirely accurate. The court had ruled. The executive branch had no intention of complying. The Cherokee had won in court and it made no difference. The Trail of Tears, the forced removal of approximately 16,000 Cherokee between 1838 and 1839, proceeded anyway. Approximately 4,000 people died during the removal of cold, disease, and exhaustion. It is called Nunadalt Suni in Cherokee, which translates roughly as the trail where they cried. Standwatie had signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835, which authorized the removal in exchange for land in Indian Territory. He was part of a faction within the Cherokee Nation that believed removal was inevitable and that negotiating the best possible terms was better than resisting the inevitable. He was wrong about the terms being good, but he was not entirely wrong about the inevitability. He survived the removal and built a life in Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. He became a significant figure in Cherokee politics, which in the decades before the Civil War were complicated by the divisions created by the removal and by the presence of enslaved people among the 5 civilized tribes, who had brought the practice of slavery with them from the southeast. During the Civil War, Standwatie sided with the Confederacy. He became a Confederate brigadier general, the only Native American to hold that rank on either side of the war, and the last Confederate general to surrender, laying down his arms in June 1865, more than 2 months after Lee's surrender at Appomattox. This is the kind of historical footnote that tends to generate more interest than the longer, slower story of Cherokee legal resistance, which is unfortunate but probably understandable. After the war, the Cherokee Nation was required to renegotiate its relationship with the United States as a consequence of its Confederate alliance. New treaties were signed. New terms were imposed. The process that had been underway before the war, the gradual reduction of Cherokee autonomy and the opening of Indian Territory to American settlement, accelerated. Standwatie died in 1871, the same year Congress ended the treaty-making process entirely. He had spent his adult life trying to navigate the space between Cherokee sovereignty and American expansion, making choices that were sometimes right and sometimes wrong and that were in any case made within constraints he had not chosen. Whether the treaty he signed in 1835 was a betrayal or a pragmatic recognition of reality is a question the Cherokee Nation has argued about for nearly 2 centuries and has not entirely resolved. Let's drift to one more figure, someone whose story takes us into the final decades of the 19th century and into the era when the treaty system had formally ended and been replaced by something called the allotment policy, which was in some ways more destructive than the treaty violations had been because it was more thoroughly systematic. We are going to spend a little time with a man named Quanah Parker. Quanah Parker was Comanche, the son of a Comanche war chief named Petanacona and a white woman named Cynthia and Parker who had been captured by the Comanche as a child and had lived among them for 24 years, married, had children, and by all accounts been thoroughly incorporated into Comanche life before being rescued, against her will, by most accounts, by Texas Rangers in 1860. Quanah was born around 1845 or 1850 and grew up as a Comanche warrior. He was not a chief by birth. His mixed heritage actually complicated his status in some Comanche bands, but he became one of the most effective leaders of the Quahati Band of Comanche, the group most resistant to American encroachment, through ability and force of personality. The Comanche had been the dominant military power on the southern plains for over a century. They had stopped Spanish expansion. They had raided deep into Mexico. They had, at their height, controlled a territory called Comancheria that covered much of present-day Texas and New Mexico. They were extraordinarily skilled horsemen and fighters, and they had maintained their independence through a combination of military effectiveness and geographic advantage. The Red River War of 1874 ended that. General William Sherman sent columns of soldiers into the Llano Estacado, the staked plains of West Texas. in the summer of 1874, and they found the Comanche and Cheyenne encampments in Palo Duro Canyon. The battle that followed was not particularly bloody. Most of the Comanche escaped, but Sherman's soldiers destroyed everything: the winter food stores, the lodges, the equipment, the horse herd. Without horses and without food going into winter, continued resistance was not possible. Quanah Parker came in to the reservation at Fort Sill in 1875. He was approximately 25 years old, and then, in one of the more remarkable personal transformations in the history of the American West, he became something entirely unexpected. He became a successful rancher. He learned English. He became the principal chief of the Comanche, a position that had not previously existed in quite that form, since the Comanche were organized in bands rather than as a single nation, but which the United States government found convenient to deal with and which Quanah found useful. He leased Comanche grazing lands to Texas cattlemen, a controversial decision among his own people but an economically rational one. He built a large house, called the Star House for the Stars, painted on its roof, and entertained visitors including Theodore Roosevelt, who came to hunt in the area and found Quanah a congenial and impressive host. He advocated for Comanche interests in Washington. He traveled to the capital multiple times. He argued against the Dawes Act of 1887, the allotment policy that was breaking up reservation land into individual parcels and selling the surplus, the land left over after each tribal member received their allotment, to white settlers. He argued that the Comanche land should remain communally held. He was not entirely wrong about the economics. The allotment policy cost Native nations approximately 90 million acres between 1887 and 1934, which is a number that requires a moment of stillness to absorb. He also, in a decision that generated significant controversy, embraced and helped spread the peyote religion, the Native American Church, which was a spiritual practice that had deep roots in indigenous tradition and which Quanah found consistent with his own experience and belief. He became one of its most prominent advocates, which put him in conflict with both Christian missionaries who wanted Native people to convert and with government officials who wanted to suppress indigenous religious practices. He died in 1911 at Fort Sill, the same place where Geronimo had died 2 years earlier, in the house he had built and the life he had constructed out of the circumstances he had been given. He was survived by several wives. He was polygamous throughout his life, which scandalized his white acquaintances and which he declined to apologize for, and many children. His mother Cynthia and Parker, who had been removed from Comanche life and returned to white Texas society against her will, had died in 1871, by some accounts of a broken heart, having outlived the daughter she had with Peta Nakona and found no way back to the life she had made among the Comanche. The Parker family story is one of those American history stories that contains several different kinds of loss simultaneously, depending on which member of the family you are following, which is one of the reasons it has attracted more attention than most. What the grass and the water remember. It is late now, very late, the kind of late where the details start to soften at the edges and the mind begins to do the work of processing rather than absorbing. Let's spend a few minutes at the end of this long journey thinking about what these stories add up to. Not a lesson exactly. History is suspicious of clean lessons. More like an accumulation of facts that sit next to each other and produce something when you hold them all in mind at once. Sitting Bull, Joseph, Geronimo, Stand Watie, Quanah Parker, and the many others we did not have time for tonight, Red Cloud, who fought and then negotiated and then spent 30 years watching the terms of his negotiations erode. Crazy Horse, who never signed anything and was killed while being taken into custody at Fort Robinson in 1877. Black Hawk, who fought in Illinois in the 1830s and afterward toured the East as a prisoner and observed American cities with the same disturbing clarity that Sitting Bull later brought to them. Plenty Coups of the Crow, who chose alliance with the United States over resistance and spent his long life discovering what that alliance actually meant. Washakie of the Shoshone, who was loyal to the United States for 60 years and received a silver saddle from Ulysses Grant and a reservation that was gradually reduced and then reduced again. Each of these men made different choices. Some fought, some negotiated, some did both at different times. Some signed treaties, some refused to. Some embraced elements of American life. Some rejected them entirely. Some found ways to maintain their cultural identity within the constraints of reservation life. Some did not survive long enough to try. What they had in common was that they were all operating within a system that was not designed to produce good outcomes for them. The treaty process assumed good faith from both parties. The United States did not operate in good faith. This is not a controversial claim. It is documented in the government's own records, in the reports of its own agents, in the findings of its own commissions. The treaties were made with the intention of buying time. When the time was up, the terms were renegotiated. When the renegotiation was resisted, the army was sent. The men who chose negotiation were not naive. Joseph knew what had happened to other nations. Quanah Parker knew what the Dawes Act was designed to do. They were making the best choices available within a set of options that had been deliberately constrained. The fact that their choices did not produce better outcomes is not a reflection on their judgment. It is a reflection on the options they were given. What strikes you, when you spend time with these stories, is not the drama of the battles or the tragedy of the surrenders, but the extraordinary duration of the aftermath. Sitting Bull spent a decade on the reservation before being killed. Joseph spent 27 years trying to return to a valley he was never allowed to see again except as a visitor. Geronimo spent 23 years as a prisoner of war. These were not brief episodes. These were the majority of these men's adult lives, spent in the long, slow, undramatic work of trying to maintain something worth maintaining inside circumstances that made maintenance very difficult. They did this with varying degrees of success and with varying degrees of bitterness and with, in most cases, a dignity that their situation did not require and that they maintained anyway. Because dignity, when everything else has been taken, is the one thing that is entirely yours. The treaties said, in their flowery 19th century language, that the land was guaranteed for as long as the grass shall grow and the water flow. The grass is still growing. The water is still flowing. The land is not what was promised. But the names are still there. Sitting Bull, Joseph, Geronimo, Quanah, Red Cloud, Crazy Horse. They refused, in the end, to be entirely erased. The plaster falls. The chisel marks remain. It is late. The lights are down. There is nothing pressing that cannot wait until morning. Sleep well. Good night.